The cost of building affordable housing in California is sometimes over $1 million per unit. And in most cases, it's between $600,000 to $800,000 a unit. People are wondering why it costs so much to build affordable housing in California. Our guest today is Tia Patterson, who's been in this space for multiple decades. And she can tell us what are the key flaws when it comes to building affordable housing and how to fix them.
That's what I mean when I say an all of the above approach. It's not just building, because you're not going to build your way out of this. You're not going to regulate your way out of this. You're not going to finance your way out of this. You've got to do all of the, and not just produce, but preserve.
I'm Tia Makorami. Welcome to California Insider. Tia, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
You have tremendous amount of experience in affordable housing. Your whole career, you've helped California in affordable housing. We want to talk to you about this because there's a lot of issues and Californians are wondering what's going on with affordable housing. Can you tell us what's challenging California right now?
I think if you look at the biggest issue facing affordable housing, it is a lack of supply of housing that is affordable at certain income levels. In addition, it's a lack of housing supply at all affordable levels, whether it is entry-level home ownership or housing for extremely low income residents. And so it's a supply issue that has been ongoing for a number of years, where we have put ourselves in a hole or a deficit because we're just not building enough housing. And then the reasons for that vary, but at its core, we're not building enough housing.
There was a time where we could develop a lot of affordable housing. Was it before the recession, right? In 2008, there was redevelopment agencies, right?
2008, we had the housing crisis, and we saw a lot of housing builders leave the industry because of default or bankruptcy, because there was so much going on after that housing crisis. But even prior to 2008, you had the last time California actually probably kept up with building the housing that it needed for its population was probably in the 80s. So you look every year, they say we need 180,000 units built a year to get to the number that we probably need, between 180,000 and 200,000 units. We're building less than 100,000 units, and we have been doing that every year since the mid-'80s, that we have built less housing. So it's been probably 40 years creating this deficit of overall supply of housing. When it comes to affordable housing, I think one of the biggest decreases in affordable housing came about when we saw the elimination of redevelopment. And that was in 2010-11, because there were 20% of the redevelopment funds were available for low-income housing. So there was a funding source that probably ranged between $1 and $2 billion a year, just over $1 billion, that was available for low-income housing. That funding source went away, but also some of the powers that a redevelopment agency went away. Elimination to the barriers, land use, some of the other structural issues that you got with redevelopment. And so we have seen a reduction in this, the financing available for affordable housing and the ability to actually build affordable housing. We've seen a reduction in that.
Now, you mentioned the reduction, and there was $1 billion or $2 billion available, and the state has its way of funding that. Can you explain to us why that's not meeting what it used to do?
Well, the ability to know year after year that you have a certain amount of revenue that's coming in on a regular basis. One of the things that you need for development, residential development, is some degree of certainty and the ability to meet certain time frames. We have in California, since the elimination of redevelopment, created other alternative funding sources. But those funding sources come by the way of housing bond measures. So we have these boom and bust, where we will go out and we'll issue debt to be able to build housing. And then when that money is gone, then you go back out and issue debt again. And so instead of having like an ongoing revenue stream, that will be there and so that people can plan and have some certainty. We have these boom or bust kind of ups and downs of the financing that's available for housing. One of the biggest tools that we use for affordable multifamily rental housing is the low-income housing tax credit. And that's been around since the late 80s, 1986, there was a tax reform, and that came about as of that. So for 40 years, we've had this tool that provides tax credits, federal tax credits to support the building of affordable housing. But that's a certain defined amount of money. And so when you have a gap, you need another source that comes in to help make sure that that housing stays affordable. And that gap financing is what redevelopment did. It came in as that gap financing so that developers knew each year how much would be available. And with alternative sources, ups or downs, it lessens that certainty that you would have that the financing is going to be there.
So financing is a big issue from what you're saying. And how does it work for a developer to get this tax credit? So they will go apply?
Yes, and it's very competitive, extremely competitive. You may have 4 to 1, 5 to 1 projects that are eligible that could get the tax credits, but there are only a number of tax credits that are available. So there's competition that goes around, and the competition comes around 4 times a year. So we have this housing finance system that is based on limited resources, but then we make it more difficult, especially when it's got state funding that's coming in for that gap to make the whole project work. That state funding is also competitive. So I've got to go compete for the state money. And then I've got to go get local money. And then I've got to go now get my tax credits. So we've made all of these hurdles on the financing end that a developer has to jump through to put their capital stack together for them to then go and be able to get the tax credits and then start building. Sometimes it takes 5 to 7 years just to put all of that together between your site and getting site control and then building up all of your capital stack. You can bring 5 to 7 different capital stacks in. We've made it very complicated to finance affordable housing, not just in California, but in the nation as general. We've created a lot because everyone wants to say that they've leveraged. So if local government says, I put in $50 and I helped create that many units, they want you to go leverage it 2 to 1. They want someone else to bring in more money. Each time you bring in a different source of financing, you have the financing charges that go along with that. So layering money on top of each money isn't really leveraging anything. It's just creating more costly cost of capital.
So a developer comes with an idea to build this kind of housing, and then they have to secure the land, right? The
Yes.
land can be bought, or is it like it could be a...
It depends. Sometimes it's bought. Sometimes it could be surplus land. It could be church land. It could be free land that is donated. But most of the time, the developer is acquiring that land. Now, when the developer acquires that land, the amount that they've paid for that land helps them in their competition for the tax credits. And so you have to show a certain amount of debt to be able to get the tax credits and to get the competitive points on the tax credits. To put the application together to get a tax credit deal, it's probably close to $100,000 just to put the application together. So these are not ma and pa's going and getting tax credits. These are sophisticated developers who are using the tax credit affordable housing finance system. So there isn't a program specifically for affordable multifamily housing just if you and I wanted to go be developers. It doesn't really exist. You have to pretty much be well-capitalized, sophisticated, experienced developer to be able to even navigate those processes.
Because it's complicated,
Oh,
right?
it's very complicated, overly complicated.
Is these kind of tax credits enough, or they have to bring other types of funding?
They have to bring other types of funding. And when you look at the history of tax credits here in the state of California, the amount of tax credits, whether it is a 9% credit, which doesn't require you to be pairing it with debt or a loan or a mortgage, you can just have the tax credits pay for the whole development. You don't have to get extra debt to go with that 9%. We also have the 4% tax credit, which has to be paired with debt. So if you look at total tax credits that are allocated in the state of California between both the 9% side and the 4% side, California, over the history of tax credit, has never exceeded about 25,000 affordable housing units, either created or preserved on an annual basis. So you're not going to be able to ever meet your financing needs with just tax credits in the state of California. And I think that's where we lose it sometimes, because everybody wants to focus on the tax credits, because that is 99% of the housing. Affordable housing for rental in the state of California, you're going to use some kind of tax credit. But if the tax credits are limited, you have to be able to say, how do I complement or supplement that tax credit system so that I'm getting more financing that's available, so that I'm getting more housing? $25,000, 25,000 units of affordable housing on an annual basis is never going to meet the need.
How many do we need?
I would say closer to probably 100,000. If you wanted to say, if you're saying we need 180,000 to 200,000 units every year, and that includes market rate, at least half of those should be made affordable to folks that are low, extremely low income to moderate income, I would say. At least half of those, probably more.
So what you're saying is we have limited amount of money for this, and we're giving it to these 25,000 units, but it doesn't really make a dent. Is there another way to use this funding?
I would say we should focus on cost efficiency. The average amount of a unit for a multifamily unit, especially if it's permanent supportive housing units, is about $700,000 a unit. That is really, really expensive. Now, you build into that it's going to stay affordable for a long term, but we don't put enough emphasis on cost. Like, are we incentivizing developers to reduce the cost of affordable housing? We put a lot of other things on affordable housing. We want it to be more energy efficient than any other development. We want it to have childcare. We want it to have extra services. We want it to be the cream of the crop. And some of those, what we view as public benefits, they cost money. And so at some point, policymakers are going to have to decide, do I want all of these layers of public benefit that cost a lot more, which means I'm going to have fewer units, or do I want to roll back some of those extras that we're putting onto affordable housing so that we can reduce the cost? I have a development now that is about 58 units of housing. It's a co-shared space. It's a beautiful development. It would be wonderful. It would be the perfect model for permanent supportive multifamily housing. The construction costs for that development was less than $300,000 a unit. Why are we not building more of those types of developments with tax credits as opposed to layering all the public benefit? And I'm not saying the public benefit is bad. What I'm saying is you have to have trade-offs. And at some point, is it worth having all of those public benefits when you know you have a supply issue, or do you want to just build more housing? Safe, sanitary, decent housing. How do we get to that? And I think what we need to do is we need to evaluate the tax credit system. We need to evaluate the scoring system. And we need to figure out a way to where we can increase that by looking at cost efficiencies.
That's what we have been wondering, because we hear the numbers for some projects, and it's like $1 million a unit, $700,000 a unit, and it's hard to fathom
to get your head around that.
Why it adds up to that. And these are big public projects.
Right.
So you think potential corruption or what's going on, but it seems there's a lot of programs in there.
It's a multiple things. It's time that it takes, the carrying costs, the financing costs for putting 7 different financing sources. It's taking 3 years to get through 3 different rounds of public funding. It's the extras that we put on affordable housing. California's regular building standards are the highest in the nation. Our energy efficiency standards are the highest in the nation. You can't hardly get any greener. But on affordable housing, we wanted them to be even greener than just our regular housing. And so it's like, let's think about this. We're saving what? A teaspoon, a tablespoon of greenhouse gas at $50,000 a door? And I know that is satire. That's probably, but That's the trade-offs that we need to be thinking about. New construction is already energy efficient. Do we need to add an extra onto that? Because every extra that we add onto that is going to increase the cost.
You mentioned the cost. Is it clear to developers? Do developers have incentives to keep the cost down, or there's no incentive in this current
I would
system?
say for housing that is financed with low-income housing tax credits, there isn't a large enough incentive to keep costs down. In 2000, we did for the state tax credits, because in 2019, the governor did pass a state tax credit, which is about $500 million that was coming in annually to help support and increase the supply, because we were underutilizing our 4%. Like, we weren't using all of it. It later became much more oversubscribed, but at that point in time, it wasn't. And that very first year of the state tax credits, the tiebreaker, or to get the state tax credits, you had to show cost efficiencies. That was later changed, that scoring system was changed, and you saw people using more state tax credits and more state subsidy. But that initial year, you did see a spike because cost efficiency was built into the program. Since then, we've rolled that back, but I do believe we really need to really think about the cost of affordable housing, streamlining that process and making it a lot less complicated.
What do you recommend? You have a lot of years of experience in this space. How would you do it with the resources we have? How would we be able to create more of these units?
I would start by a thorough evaluation of our tax credits. And I would start with and we have a housing plan. We have local governments who have plans. Sometimes it's just talking to one another. And the state, in my opinion, shouldn't be picking individual projects. The state should serve more of, if they're providing funding, we are going to defer that to local governments to do if local governments have all of their pieces in place. We sometimes, as the state of California, do it backwards, in my opinion, and that we want to dictate the individual projects, where what you should be saying is, if your projects look like this and meet these basic parameters, here's your block funding, local governments, because local governments are the ones that are approving the actual developments. So how do you incentivize local governments to quickly approve housing so that you're not running against those roadblocks? You give local governments that political cover to approve the housing, and you do more block grants. I think this notion or this narrative that if it's competition, that you get the best product, I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think those projects that meet certain parameters that are ready to go and shovel ready should be able to go to a counter and say, my project's ready to go. I meet all these, first come, first serve with the projects that look a certain way, and they get the financing. How do we create a system that is more shovel ready, ready to go, providing developer certainty that decreases the time? I think you would get more projects.
And you mentioned the local governments, they have the main say in approving these, right? In terms of underground. Can you explain that, how the process works?
Each land use decision, whether it's approving something, whether it's a commercial development or a housing development, local government approves those projects on a discretionary basis. Those projects will come before their planning commission and sometimes their city council. On those discretionary actions, they can say no, and oftentimes feel pressure to say no, because that's when NIMBYs will show up and say, we don't want you to build that housing. Because property taxes or affordable housing, you get less property taxes, a local government may be more inclined to approve that car lot as opposed to that housing development. So we have created a set of policies that incentivize local government not necessarily to approve housing development. So how do you roll back those policies to incentivize local government to actually approve housing?
So your thought is that right now, from what I'm gathering, is if I have a project, I'll go to different agencies to get these tax credits, and then Then after I got the credits, got the financing, then I go to my local government, or I might have talked to them, but then I go to my local government for approval. Is that how it works?
Yes, in effect, local government is, hopefully you're talking to local government all along the way. But if you were able, and I know the governor has a proposal now, and where they say that they want to align state resources so that developers aren't having to go to all of these different places. But they also have to align the programs, because each of the programs may have a different set of rules. So, and each policymaker, bless their hearts, they want special veterans housing. They want homeless housing. They want transitional housing. They want housing and so then they create a program for each different population. What you need is affordable housing, just blanket affordable housing. And so to be able to have money that could fit all of those needs, one pot of money that can go to any of those needs would be easier to administer than 15 to 20 different programs. I feel really sorry for our Department of Housing and Community Development. That staff, there's been over 150 pieces of housing legislation in just the last 5 years. That staff has grown from 400 full-time employees to over 1,600 full-time employees in just the last 5 years. And then they're trying to enforce and put in place all of these new programs for housing. That's a lot. How do we slow down to speed up? How do we slow down to be more efficient? I think they're constantly drinking from a fire hose because our policymakers want to create policies that they think are going to help. What you're doing is you have staff that are almost tripping over each other because they're trying to keep up. But what we need is one program that finances a variety of affordable housing that then can be used for senior housing, foster youth housing, veterans housing, but one pot of money that fits the needs of that particular community, as opposed to creating 40 different programs that each have a different set of rules.
So essentially what you're recommending from what I'm gathering is we need to go back to the basics of affordable housing first, and just doing that and using the systems and credits we have to and lower the cost significantly.
Yes.
And then apply that to all these communities that need it.
Yes. Think about it. If you have an affordable housing development, each local government has to approve what's called a general plan that tells you what they're going to build when and how over the course of the 5 to 10 years of that general plan. Every local government in the state of California has a general plan. As part of that general plan, they have what's called a housing element, where you are provided a number that says, these are your regional housing needs, and this is the amount of affordable housing or housing at all income levels we want you to build. So if that local government is building housing that's consistent with that general plan and consistent with your housing element, why is it not just approved by right? Why do I have to go get a yes or no? I should just be able to take it to the counter, someone look at it, say that it works, it fits, and we're going to build it. But we've created so much complication in our system. That's not what happens. Because now, if I take it and the local government has to make a discretionary action, now I've invoked what's called CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. So CEQA, in my opinion, is not always used as a shield, but as a sword. And a lot of times you'll see YIMBYs, or not YIMBYs, the NIMBYs using CEQA to just ban the affordable housing from being built altogether. And so think about when CEQA came about. It came about in the 70s when there were no environmental rules or environmental regulation. People were just dumping toxic waste. Since the onslaught or since the beginning of CEQA, we now have a whole regulatory framework for air, water, that we didn't have before CEQA came about. So CEQA is a disclosure law that's supposed to disclose to you whether or not there is an environmental impact on whatever it is I'm building. If you have regulations that are monitoring the air and preventing you from doing bad things to the air or bad things to the water or to the ground, Why do I need CEQA? For a residential development that's consistent with everything that already exists. So you'll hear from developers all the time, we want a CEQA exemption. I would go even further. Why do you need CEQA when you have environmental regulations in place that already protect the environment? CEQA came about at a time when you didn't have those environmental regulations. So sometimes I think we should stop and look at the circumstances and look at the history and understand, how do we get back to simpler basics? Do we need to be able to do all of these things? Should we give someone the right to bring a lawsuit against something that already is within the regulatory framework and is consistent with laws that we already have on the book? Why should they have the ability to keep that development from being built?
Now, in terms of local governments getting involved, in your thoughts is you should give the money to them, or have them have access to the money. So then when they have the money, then it's their project, then they have to champion it with the community.
Yes, I think there is a distrust that local government is not going to do the right thing. There's this tension, the state and local governments, and local government wants local control, and the state wants them to build all this housing. The state is not building any housing, none. Local government is approving the housing. Developers, the private sector, is building the housing. So who are our essential partners? And how do we actually come to the table to partner with them as opposed to making it more difficult for them? So long as we look as local government as our adversary at the state level and look at developers as an adversary as opposed to a strategic partner and coming together, I think we talked earlier about civility. Can we all come to the table and have a reasonable solution to how we're going to get this done? Because you all need each other. You need some of the resources from the state, you need the approval powers of local government, and you need the private sector to come in who's actually building these housing. Without any of those partners at the table, you're not going to be able to get it done.
And Tia, how would you do it if you had a blank slate of able to just
It took us years to get into this mess. There is no one size fits all. There are no silver bullets. But I do think we should take a step back and look at the whole system. I think what we're doing is we're doing a little piecemeal without taking a step back and looking at it holistically. We need an all of the above approach, where you are supporting everything from homeless shelters to entry-level homeownership. We've made it very difficult for developers to build smaller, single-family, entry-level homeownership. We don't incentivize it. We've made it very difficult. We focused on homelessness and we focused on permanent supportive housing, and we focused a lot of attention on that segment of the population because we have a horrible homeless crisis in the state of California. But you're seeing a different kind of homelessness. You're seeing working families who are now living out of their cars, but still going to work. So that means we're not supporting the entire system or the entire spectrum of affordable housing. And so how do we create a system that supports the entire spectrum of affordable housing, from homelessness to entry-level home ownership? When they say all boats rise when the tides rise, if you're just focusing on one segment, which is the most expensive housing there is, then you're going to throw the market off. How do you actually support the market with your policies and your resources so that all boats will rise when the tides rise?
So you mentioned working together. In an ideal scenario, because these are affordable housing, so the developer probably may not earn a lot of money, right? Or how would it work in an ideal scenario?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I think there's this, especially in the affordable housing space, there's this belief that developers are making a lot of money. Developers are capped at a $2.5 million developer fee. Their construction of the affordable housing could be $40-50 million, but they're limited to a $2.5 million developer fee. That cap on developer fee had been in existence for 25 years. They just raised the cap like 2 years ago because there's this false narrative or false belief that they're making a lot of money. They are not making a lot of money and oftentimes what happens in affordable housing is that they'll do what's called deferring the developer fee. And they'll use the deferred developer fee as part of their sources and uses so that it comes in as capital as part of that capital stack. So I'm going to give up my money to help pencil this deal. And when you defer a developer fee, or you could use that as one of your sources, you can leverage and get more tax credits. So oftentimes they'll defer that developer fee over a certain period of time to get more tax credits and help pay for the deal. So there's this real belief from policymakers that developers are making a lot of money. No, that's not really true. And what we see in California, where it's trending now, not just in California, but nationwide, following COVID, the income that was coming in on affordable housing has not met projections because we deferred rents. People weren't paying rents. Remember that. People were not paying rents. Rents got suspended. So income coming into these properties were less, but expenses were up. And so we've put a lot of pressure on housing in that we want to limit the amount of rents. And a lot of times you can't raise the rents because you have a regulatory agreement, and because of the funding that you took, you have to keep the rents at a certain level, and you can't raise those rents. But the expenses are rising faster than the income. And so we're creating a gap, and we're putting a lot of pressure on affordable housing. And I'm really worried so we've been focusing on production, which rightly we should, because that's the biggest issue. But if you don't have a preservation strategy, what happens in year 15 when that tax credit investor is gone and no longer watching the project? What happens when that project is now upside down financially, when the income is less than the expenses and that project can no longer pay its mortgage? I think we need to pay attention to that. And we, as policymakers in the state of California, have not looked comprehensively at the system. At some point, you can be filling up a bucket full of water, but if you have a hole in the bucket and you're losing just as much, you're never going to be able to make any headway, because you have to pay attention to those units that may be lost and that affordability that may be lost while you're building the affordable housing.
How can they be lost? Would they get foreclosed?
They get foreclosed upon. If you go into default and you're foreclosed upon, that affordability is lost.
So essentially, you have the rental units that are paying you rent as a developer at a certain amount, but your costs have gone up.
Yes.
And now you're upside down.
Yes.
So then you default, and a new investor will come in, and would it still be affordable?
Well, if it's after year 15, the investor's gone. So that's my point. My point is we may have a problem. We may have a problem with those projects that are now coming to year 15 that may be financially upside down.
So who will have to take them?
The state and the local government should be coming up with a preservation strategy. Someone needs to be thinking about, out of my portfolio, I'm in Irvine, all of the affordable housing in the city of Irvine that we may have put money into. What does that portfolio look like? Is it fiscally sound? The city of Irvine, came in and put $6 million in that deal. Is that deal penciling still in year 15? Or is it financially getting ready to go belly up? No one, in my opinion, is really paying attention to those fiscal problems that are coming as a result of COVID, rents, people not paying rents, and income not meeting the expenses.
The cost going up.
Insurance is 200 to 300 to 400% over premiums that we weren't paying before. And so those costs are constantly rising, but those incomes are limited. Who's paying attention to that? Now, I told you tax credits came about in the late 80s. So those original tax credit deals went for 30 years, not 55 years. So those tax credit deals that are coming to year 30, when that regulatory agreement expires, does that housing going to go market rate or is it going to stay affordable? Who's paying attention to that? So there are preservation issues coming up because either the loss of the regulatory agreement has expired or because those properties are now fiscally upside down. We should be paying attention to that.
So what can happen if these projects go belly up? Would they get foreclosed and sold to new investors and then the rents will go up? Essentially, they could go out of being affordable.
They could go out of going, worst case scenario, they will no longer be affordable. Best case scenario, you have local governments, the lender, and a new affordable housing developer stepping in to preserve that. But that requires people having a conversation. That requires you paying attention to knowing what your portfolio looks like. The default rate on a tax credit deal is historically low. A tax credit multifamily residential development is probably one of the safest asset classes there are. But what we're seeing is a trend. What we're seeing are projects that would have never gone into default, trending toward having expenses that exceed the income coming into that project. That's a new phenomenon. We haven't historically seen that. And because we're starting to see these trends, I really think we, whether it's local government, the state of California, need to be working together on preservation strategies because preservation is just as important as production. You have to have both. That's what I mean when I say an all of the above approach. It's not just building because you're not going to build your way out of this. You're not going to regulate your way out of this. You're not going to finance your way out of this. You've got to do all of the, and not just produce, but preserve.
Now, Tia, this phenomenon, is it national too, or is it mostly California?
I would say we are probably at the forefront, but it is a national issue. And people are paying attention now because they realize this has been a problem, ongoing problem for decades. But when you and I have children that can't afford to buy a house in their own neighborhood, that's when everybody starts paying attention. When it hits you personally, when you see the homeless population exploding and you're saying, what is going on? When you're driving down the street and you see you can actually visualize it, then that's when you realize it's a problem. But this is a problem that's been in the making for 40 years, where we have underbuilt and taken away resources and frameworks that were put in place to be able to support a housing system. You have a problem because those frameworks, those finances were taken away, and we have not thought to come back and reevaluate the whole system and think about how to uplift a system so that all boats rise.
Now, Tia, you have dedicated your whole career to this, right? Why?
Because I was a kid who grew up in public housing, owned by the Housing Authority in the Central Valley. My mom was a single mom. She worked Sears and Roebuck, and in the 70s, when women weren't allowed to take a mortgage out in their own name, that's just recently, this was my mother, was able to take advantage of changes in the law that allowed her as a single woman to purchase a home using a down payment assistance program. So I have seen where safe, sanitary, and stable housing has been able to change lives and break generational cycles of poverty. My sister and I both have advanced degrees. I own my own home. My sister owns her own home. Because of that support of having safe, sanitary, and decent housing, that is kind of what they say, the American dream. Now, whether it's home ownership or just having a safe place to lay your head that's not under a bridge, that you know your kids will be able to come home and study. So these are the reasons why I'm passionate about this, because I have seen where housing, affordable housing, has been able to help change my life. So this is something I'm very passionate about because I've lived it and I've had those lived experiences.
By now, you should know that we are part of the Epoch Times newspaper. Having this paper associated with us, we are able to get story ideas and a lot of sources. Now, this week's paper had one amazing story about what's happening with the Tijuana sewage crisis. We actually have been covering this crisis on the show. Now we are hearing that the sewage is actually going airborne and miles away into the San Diego coast, up to even La Jolla. There's also another story that's fascinating in the paper. It's about equitable grading. Remember, California Insider, we covered equitable grading from all perspectives, from the parents to the teachers, the people that actually created equity grading program, and superintendents of schools who implemented it. Now, San Francisco just rejected the equity grading method for the school district, and the paper has the story in it. We have a special deal for you. You can subscribe for $1 a week for the digital edition. You can also get the print. You will be surprised by the quality of journalism that goes into this paper. Now let's go back to the interview. This phase, some challenges the state is facing, especially with affordability. What do you think of the future of California?
Housing should be so nonpartisan. Like, whether you're blue, red, or purple, whether you believe in the right or the left, we all need a safe, sanitary, decent place to live. And so getting back to civility and having those conversations about what trade-offs are we willing to give so that we can address this crisis. If that means your neighbor is going to have the ability to build an ADU or a duplex, should you be able to say no to that because you want to be a NIMBY? We have to be able to all come together and be able to say, let's move forward. Let's come together. Let's not fight one another about the creation and preservation of housing at all income levels. Sometimes you hear from the far right, and sometimes you hear from the far left. From the far right, you're hearing things like, get rid of affirmatively furthering fair housing. I think language matters, because you don't want to get rid of affirmatively furthering fair housing, because the reason why we have a crisis in some neighborhoods is because you redlined certain neighborhoods. You kept and excluded whole communities from being able to buy a house. You thwarted generational wealth because of certain government regulations. So affirmatively furthering fair housing is necessary to ensure that we're meeting our housing needs. And so that's a fight from the far right. And then you can even get it from the far left, where you have some of the biggest NIMBYs are in some of our most liberal communities where they don't want increased density because they don't want to block the sunshine from their tomato plants. So we need to stop listening to the far right. We need to stop listening to the far left, and we need to come together with practical solutions. Is it really the need to pay a higher prevailing commercial wage on a small apartment complex that's privately owned in the Central Valley? Why am I paying San Francisco wages for a small apartment complex in the Central Valley? Is that really the trade-off we want to make? Why am I requiring extra 10% energy efficiency on top of the highest energy standards there already are in the nation? Is that really necessary? So we have to be honest about what's important to us in the state of California and have honest conversations about what are the trade-offs, what is needed, and how are we really going to address this issue.
So you grew up in affordable housing, and you managed to become one of the leaders in the state on this topic. How did you do that?
The first home we lived in was the family home. And it was my grandmother, my mother, the two kids, some of my uncles, this beautiful home. This was the home that my great-grandfather had built. That home burned down when I was 5 years old. And so the family kind of split up. My mother, who was a single mom, we went and we had public housing. in that public housing that we lived in was in the middle of a neighborhood. I didn't know I was poor. I was poor, but like in my mind, I didn't know I was poor. So it was a fourplex in the middle of a neighborhood. We had teachers that lived in the neighborhood. We had my mom who worked part-time at Sears and Roebuck. We had, the dentist lived in the neighborhood because it was like this affordable housing in the middle of a neighborhood. So after school, we would go to Miss Luttrell's house. Miss Luttrell was the captain of the police's mother. So I grew up in a community and a support system, but it was affordable housing. And so having affordable housing and mixed income housing and weaving that into the fabric of the community, I think is so important. It is important to not redo the mistakes of our past. We shouldn't be creating ghettos. We shouldn't be concentrating poverty in areas of concentrated poverty. And sometimes that's what happens because that's the cheapest land to buy is in those distressed neighborhoods. Now, I'm not saying don't build in distressed neighborhoods, but ensure that you balance that. High resource areas, low resource areas. We need affordable housing in both. It's not an either or, it's an and. And so incorporating that and, I think, is important. And for me, seeing that as a kid and growing up where I saw, housing that I lived with kids and didn't know I was poor. I didn't know I was poor until I got ready to apply for college. And then I looked at the FAFSA and I was like, oh, this can't be right. This is below the federal poverty. My mother was like, yeah, no, that's right. I make $1 out of 99 cents. And so just having that as a kid and growing up and the stories and sitting with my sister, it's like there's one particular story I tell sometimes when I go and have conversations about affordable housing. I don't see affordable housing and the partners of affordable housing as like a pie. I don't see it like that. Because with a pie, each person gets their slice. When I was a kid growing up, my mother had these single friends. They all had kids. And once a month, we would get together, we would rotate houses and we would get together and we would it was called the Potluck Fridays. On Fridays, we would all have a potluck. We would bring whatever was in the refrigerator. My mother, we would go through the refrigerator. You'd have spaghetti with weenies chopped in with tomato sauce or leftover fried chicken or bread. And we, as kids, thought that was like the best time in the world. Like, oh my goodness, it's Potluck Friday. Like we looked forward to Potluck Friday. So after I became an adult, my sister and I were sitting down talking to my mother and we were like, oh my God, we love Potluck Fridays. And my mother started laughing. And she said, that wasn't for fun. That was because we were so poor. We didn't have enough food for us to feed our own family. But if we brought everything together, we would have enough to be able to make meals and to feed all of the kids. So that was out of necessity that we did that. That wasn't just social. But then I was like, what if we looked at affordable housing like a potluck? Like everybody brings something to the table. Have you ever been to a potluck? Like there's always food. There's food left over. There's all kinds of food. So if everybody brought a dish, bring 2 dishes. But if everybody brought something to the table, then you're not fighting over the crumbs that are left over. It's everybody gets to get fed. And so if we could envision it like that, I think we would be better off.
Tia Patterson, President and CEO of California Community Reinvestment. It was great to have you on California Insider.
Thank you. It was good to be here.
Let us know your thoughts on how we can solve the affordability issues in California, especially when it comes to housing. You can always email us at siamak@californiainsider.com or comment. We read all of your emails and comments. I'm Siamak Khorrami, this is California Insider, and we will see you next time.